Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with the Brazilian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Nestor Forster. My name is Nick Burns. I'm the faculty chair of the Future of Diplomacy Project. It's a pleasure to see you all here. We're looking forward to a good conversation. I want to welcome Carl Kaiser, who is a great force here at the Kennedy School. One of our great experts on Europe. I want to welcome Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, who is the executive director of our Future Diplomacy Project, Paula Dobriansky, my former colleague from the State Department, former Undersecretary of State, and Ambassador Cliff Sobel, who is a very close friend of mine and of Tom Shannon's, and our former American ambassador to Brazil, and many others. You're all welcome. I want to say a word of welcome to Ambassador Forster. We were just talking now. We had a chance to talk also last week by phone. This is the third time that he has served in the United States representing the government of Brazil, so he knows us very well. He's also served in Canada and other countries in the Americas. He's a very experienced career diplomat, so he is welcome here at the Kennedy School. We're looking forward to Ambassador Forster, who's going to speak at the beginning, make a brief statement about the current status of the relationship between Brazil and the United States. Then he's going to be joined by Ambassador Tom Shannon and by Erika Manouselis for a conversation. Tom Shannon probably needs no introduction to this group, longtime American diplomat, former United States ambassador to Brazil. Tom served twice in Brazil, former Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, and Tom and I worked very closely together in the George W. Bush second term when I was Undersecretary of State, and I learned most of what I know, which is not much, by the way, about Latin America through Tom Shannon. He's been a good friend and a great colleague in the Foreign Service, and Tom is now a non-resident fellow at our Future Diplomacy Project. So Tom will lead the conversation with the ambassador, but Erika Manouselis will as well. Erika is a member of our staff here at the Harvard Kennedy School. She works at the Future Diplomacy Project, and Erika knows a lot about Brazil. And so Erika and Tom will run that conversation. And following that conversation, we're going to open it up to all of you to ask questions. I think this is an interactive Zoom session, so I think everyone knows the Zoom protocol. If you want to ask a question, just go to the participants bar, press the raise hand button. Erika will call on you in the order that people choose to speak. We're looking forward to a good conversation. Of course, here at Harvard, as in I think almost all American universities, we deeply prize academic freedom. We believe it's our duty and it's our responsibility to be talking to people on all sides of issues. And if there are people on opposite sides of arguments, we want to talk to both sides. We believe, of course, in critical thinking. We believe in analytical thought. We believe in criticism and active debate, but we also believe in civility and openness and tolerance. And in that spirit, we welcome all of you here today, as well as the ambassador. Ambassador, you're most welcome. And let me turn this over to my friend and Foreign Service colleague, Tom Shannon.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a great pleasure to be here with everyone today for this conversation with Brazil's ambassador to the United States. I've known the ambassador for many years. We were just discussing about an effort that we both participated in at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration when then President-elect Lula came to the United States and met with President Bush. And based on that meeting, we were able to fashion an approach that allowed the White House to share its logistical, political, and administrative processes with the incoming Lula administration in order to help the Lula administration understand the kinds of challenges that it would be facing as it took over the Palácio do Planalto and began to govern in Brazil. So Ambassador Forster has a deep history in the United States, a deep history in US-Brazil relations, and has served across significant political change in both countries. So Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today. We look forward to this conversation. And it would be helpful to us if you could begin the conversation by just framing the relationship as you've seen it based on your experience and time in Washington.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shannon. Thank you, Ambassador Burns, for organizing this conversation. I see a lot of old friends here. Let me just quickly recognize a couple of them. Ambassador Sobel, good to see you again. Paula Dobriansky, good to see you. Stan Gacek, good to see you again. And I'll stop there, otherwise I'll spend the whole time here greeting people. But thank you very much. It's an honor to be here at the Kennedy School with you today to discuss a little bit about Brazil-US relations. I like to start the conversation always reminding, where we are, and to know where we are, we have to know where we come from. And, it's been said a lot of times that we enjoy almost this 2-century-old relationship, very friendly relationship, but few people realize that Brazil and the US, from the Brazilian point of view, this is the oldest, the longest standing relationship Brazil has with any country in the world. It's almost two centuries old, and it's been based in shared values, democracy, the rule of law, economic freedom, respect for human rights, and so on. And let me I like to mention a couple of highlights here. Of course, we were first established relations when President Monroe was at the White House, and this was 1824. We had, when the US completed its first centennial in 1876, we had what was, I think, the first visit by a foreign head of state to Washington and to other parts of the United States by the Brazilian Emperor, Peter II, Pedro II. He spent, I think, 3 or 4 months traveling around the United States as a tribute for the US having been the first one to recognize Brazilian independence. In 1891, we had, the first Brazilian, just a few years later, we had the proclamation of the Republic in Brazil when we adopted our first Republican Constitution in 1891 in an effort that was led by the great Rui Barbosa and his team. And he inspired himself to a large extent in the American Constitution, bringing to Brazil several institutions which were originally crafted in the United States, including the name of the country until the mid-40s was called Estados Unidos do Brasil, the United States of Brazil, which is an interesting curiosity. But, with that constitution came not only the administrative organization of Brazil, the bicameral Congress, the presidency, the checks and balances, balance of powers, etc., but also the values, this shared respect for freedom that both our societies have. We had other landmarks in the beginning of the 20th century. The first American Chamber of Commerce anywhere in the world was created in Sao Paulo in the early 20th century. Today it's the largest one in the world. Then we had also the big event of fighting together alongside in World War II against Nazism and fascism in the southern Italy theater. Brazil was the only Latin American country to send troops there, and we sent 25,000 of our pracinhas to fight with our American friends there. And it's something that, forged a friendship between our defense establishments that lasts to this day. We have developed over time many ties and many areas of cooperation. I'll not bother you too much with the history. Let's jump into, the current scene against that long historical background that I just mentioned with the very brief highlights. So, we have a new administration here in Washington, and the Bolsonaro administration started, I think, with the right foot, sending a letter. President Bolsonaro addressed a letter to President Biden on the very day of his inauguration, greeting the US, recalling the shared values, the historical background of our relationship, and also setting a very ambitious agenda for what lays ahead of us to continue to strengthen our great relationship. That letter was replied by President Biden in a very positive tone, recalling also the same ties and historical background, and also stressing the American priorities for cooperation with Brazil, highlighting the environment, highlighting the fight against the pandemic. We've been working on those fronts. I'm happy to report that we have a very positive engagement with the new administration in several different areas, between our Itamaraty of Foreign Affairs and the Department of State, but also in the agencies across the government. We've been working together to fight the pandemic. We are very glad to continue to have this engagement with a group of experts led by the White House to which Brazilians were invited, Brazilian scientists and the Brazilian Minister of Science and Technology, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, to discuss new developments and challenges we face with the emergence of these variants. In the area of the environment, I was a proponent, and I'm glad to report that we have successfully engaged the new administration early on this very crucial topic that cuts across so many areas. And I personally had a very good conversation with former Secretary of State John Kerry, now Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, and we basically laid out a framework to continue discussions. We later had a meeting between Secretary Kerry and the Brazilian Foreign Minister, the Brazilian Minister of the Environment, and that laid out for technical meetings which are ongoing as we speak, trying to explore ways for Brazil and the US to cooperate both at the bilateral level. What can we do together to reduce deforestation in the Amazon? How can we bring new technology, new investments for the bioeconomy, create opportunity for the 25 million Brazilians who live there and who are victim of what we call the Amazonian paradox, the wealthiest region in Brazil in terms of natural resources, also shows the lowest index of human development. So that's something we need to address, and we appreciate the US willingness to work with us in bringing opportunity for those Brazilians, basically bringing what we worked together on back in the 90s, in 92 at the UN conference in Rio, bringing sustainable development, caring about the environment, but also not neglecting the social and economic development, which is a big challenge for us. Aside from that, we have an institutional framework going on very well in different areas for trade, commercial, defense sector. Speaking of defense, we just had now in January and February what is likely the largest military exercise, joint exercise that we ever had. And it's something that the US enjoys with very few allies. And we bought a whole company of parachutists from Brazil using Brazilian equipment, the Embraer KC-390 aircraft. And they had also those exercises going on for a couple of weeks in Louisiana. And what I hear, I spoke with US Southcom Commander Admiral Fowler. He had high praise for how this went. So we're glad to see that continued cooperation going forward. We also have a very private dialogue in the private sector with our CEO forum. We are in permanent touch with the chambers of commerce on both sides in the private sector. And we hear a continued interest to deepen our economic relations, both in the trade and investment side. The US remains the largest foreign investor in Brazil. And that shows the level of interest of American companies in Brazil and the amount of joint ventures, the very dynamic dialogue that's ongoing between the private sector. Let me just highlight two more points, and then I'll be quiet to listen to questions you might have. I just like to point out, the ground we are breaking with this cooperation that we recently concluded between the Smithsonian Institution and our Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation. This has several components, including environmental one on biodiversity. There's joint research to be done. There's cultural preservation using tremendous expertise of the Smithsonian in museums and so on. But it goes beyond that. It will enable Brazil, the Ministry of Education in Brazil, to use Smithsonian generated materials to teach sciences, to teach STEM disciplines in the Brazilian public school system. So this is a tremendous education and also social outreach of which we are very proud of. Last but not least, we are in the last stages of concluding a formal adhesion of Brazil to the Artemis project. As you know, it's the most ambitious project for space exploration going on in the world right now, and Brazil is very proud to be part of that. I'll stop here just with a last word saying that I just touch briefly here on the very broad agenda we have for the governments, the ongoing dialogue between the two administrations, the two governments. But beyond that, there's also a very vibrant dialogue that goes beyond the governments between our societies. be it in the educational realm, and those of you affiliated with Harvard and other institutions who join us today are witnesses to that, the very vibrancy of exchange between our researchers, our students, and that's something that has its own dynamic. It goes beyond that, of course, in terms of tourism, when we don't have the scourge of the pandemic going on, the millions of Brazilians who visit the United States every year. And I mean, I could go on and on, our cultural exchanges. I'll stop here, and I'm glad to address whatever questions you might have for me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and very much appreciate you laying out what is a very rich bilateral agenda. In May of 2013, then Vice President Joe Biden traveled to Brazil, and he began his trip in Rio de Janeiro. And in a speech that he gave in Rio, he said that the future of U.S.-Brazil relationships, the future of the U.S.-Brazil relationship was on global issues. And one of the biggest and most important issues you touched on briefly, which is the environment and especially climate change. And I note that President Biden has just issued invitations to 40 countries to participate in a conference in late April on climate change. And Brazil and President Bolsonaro were among those invited. Could you please describe what Brazil will bring to that conference, recognizing that Brazil since 1992 has been an important player in global environmental talks, but there is a perception that under President Bolsonaro, that Brazil has taken a different approach. And so could you please give us some insight into how the Brazilian government understands climate change as an issue and what President Bolsonaro will bring to the conference in April?
Thank you, Ambassador Shannon. Excellent question. Look, what will Brazil bring to the table? It will bring basically two things. Its tremendous environmental credentials, having, being host to the largest biodiversity in the planet, having 2/3 of its original vegetation cover intact in our country, having one of the cleanest energy matrices in the world. 46% of all energy generated in Brazil comes from renewable sources. That goes up to 82% if we talk only about the electricity sector. So those are incredible credentials that we bring. We also bring a commitment and a level of, I'd say, expertise of participating in this in discussions for a very long time. You correctly mentioned, that the conference in Rio in '92. That's something that my generation of diplomats in Itamaraty is very proud of. We are getting out of our diplomatic academy when that conference is about to take place. So that was one of our first experiences, first-hand experiences dealing with diplomatic issues, was the whole challenge of environmental protection, of sustainable development. And that was a concept that became universalized back then in Rio '92, the concept of sustainable development. And as I said in my opening remarks, that's something that remains the challenge for us, especially when you talk about the Amazon. So what concretely does Brazil expect to do? We expect to be able to make concrete progress and concrete commitments in this area in the upcoming months, leading to COP26 in November. We have challenges in Brazil. Sometimes we complain that the press and some people exaggerate, but it's not everything is an exaggeration. There are real challenges on the ground. One of them is this trend that started in 2013, over 80 years ago, of an increasing rate of deforestation in the Amazon. Even though still today, what we had, the latest data shows it's 41% below our baseline of 2005, which is Brazil's voluntary baseline for the Paris Agreement benchmarking. It's still below. Of course, it's unacceptable because it's going on. So there's been a very strong reaction in the past 2 years, engaging our military, engaging all resources available in this so-called Operation Green Brazil 1 and 2 to fight deforestation, to fight illegal mining. And let me just report here, I have the data here as a few results, concrete results, so we are not only in the rhetoric realm. Operation Green Brazil 2 has confiscated over 1,600 boats, 500 vehicles, 11 million cubic feet of timber, fruit of illegal logging. It has applied over $620 million in fines and almost 300 people have been arrested. So that's how effective it has been. Of course, more needs to be done. But we have some good news. We have some preliminary data showing for the first time a dent in this upward trajectory of deforestation. And the data for the 6 months between August last year and January 2021 show a decrease of 21% in the number of events. That's, if we take specific states like the state of Mato Grosso, they have even a better picture. Mato Grosso boasts a decrease in deforestation of 34% year over year. So that's what we want to bring, but we have more. We are committed to making, the whole question of payment for ecosystem services work. We think that might unlock a key to solve what I call the Amazonian paradox, bringing opportunity for the people in the region. We also are very much committed to having a carbon market that works to the benefit of everyone, for the planet and for the Brazilians who live in the Amazon. So it's not a small plate that we have to bring on board. And we very much appreciate the engagement that we have found, the seriousness with which we have the ongoing talks with Secretary Kerry's team and the whole Biden administration for this continuing dialogue in what we see as a win-win cooperation, where the US will be in a position to bring expertise, technology, financial resources to the table. Brazilians will bring this renewed commitment to work together to fight climate change, to bring sustainable development to those who need it most.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure when we open up to general questions, there will be plenty of more questions about the environment and climate change. Let me take a moment and turn to health cooperation, in particular, the pandemic. Both the United States and Brazil have been hit very hard by COVID, with over 500,000 dead in the United States and over 300,000 dead in Brazil. With the US launched on a major vaccination program, but it appears that Brazil is stumbling on the vaccination side. Could you describe what's happening in Brazil at this point, and especially whether or not there are conversations between the United States and Brazil about how to advance a vaccination agenda?
Excellent question, very timely one. Look, what we have in Brazil is a very dire situation. Let's not, I don't want to paint a different picture from what's going on. It's a big challenge, and our thoughts and our prayers go to all those who fell victim of the COVID pandemic and their families. Having said that, there's a tremendous effort going on in Brazil in several fronts. Number one, on the vaccination front, the latest data I have here shows that over 33 million vaccines have been distributed. 13 million have been administered. I think this number is a little outdated, it's even more than that. 15 million is what I have, 15 million vaccines. It's about 7 or 8% of our population. That places Brazil as the 5th country which has administered the largest numbers of vaccines to its population. We have contracted over 200 million vaccines up to June, July, middle of the year. Just a few weeks ago, Brazil celebrated an agreement with Pfizer, the American producer, for 100 million vaccines that should start to roll out in the very short time now in April. We also acquired another 38 million vaccines from Johnson & Johnson. And of course, we are members of COVAX, contributing members of the consortium for COVAX, of which we have received. And on top of that, we have already local efforts in Brazil, aside from producing vaccines by Fundação Oswaldo Cruz Fiocruz, the Butantan Institute in São Paulo, using the pharmacological active ingredients which are imported. We also have an ongoing effort to develop our own vaccine, and I've heard that effort will soon begin clinical trials. So that's one front. On the economic front, what we've done, it's something unprecedented. About 8% of Brazil's GDP has been used as transfers for states and municipalities which are at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic. But also we did something which was a direct cash transfer to those most vulnerable in Brazil, including those people who are in the informal sector. And those resources, we're talking about over $50 billion were transferred to 67 million Brazilians over this past year. And those have had a tremendous social impact, a positive one. And this program was praised even by the World Bank, the IMF, and other international institutions. So the challenge remains, and on the vaccine front, perhaps we could actually receive some more assistance from the United States government if we get to a situation where it's confirmed that the U.S. stockpile has a surplus of vaccines and is in a position to lend some vaccines for Brazil. It's basically a logistical challenge that we have at this point going forward.
Thank you very much. Erika?
I have two questions for you, Ambassador. The first has to do with the U.S.-China relationship. So on March 22nd, the United States, along with allies Canada, the UK, and the EU, announced sanctions on several Chinese officials alleged to have links to what US officials call a genocidal campaign against Uyghur Muslims. What is Brazil's reaction to these sanctions? How does Brazil navigate an increasingly tense relationship between China, with whom it shares some interests as an emerging power and member of BRICS, and the US, its hemispheric partner?
Look, China falls a little bit outside of my dossier here as ambassador in Washington, but what I can say is that we have a mature relationship with China. China has become our largest trading partner for the past decade, overtaking the United States, importing lots of foodstuffs and raw materials from Brazil. Of course, Brazil plays a very important role for food security in China and also elsewhere. China also has an important presence in terms of investments in Brazil. With the US, I don't need to restate what I said here at the outset. We have a shared history and shared values. Democracy, respect for human rights, economic freedom. Those are values both our societies cherish. We also have a very intense relationship with the United States in the trade and economic realm. The US is the largest market for Brazilian manufacturer exports. The US remains, as I also said, the first foreign investor in Brazil, to the tune of 5 times the FDI stock of China in Brazil. The latest data available for 2019 from the central bank shows the US is $145 billion in FDI in Brazil. China has some $28 billion. But in terms of the whole question of sanctions, human rights, etc., of course, we took due note of the announcement here. Brazil remains committed, and it's something which is in our constitution, the respect for human rights. We are very active in all international forum in this front. And we have just recently supported, working together with the US, supported a resolution for countries to not avoid the whole question of sovereignty, to use it as a shield, not to go into the scrutiny of international human rights organizations within the United Nations system, Commission for Human Rights, and so on. So that commitment remains very high. Brazil was a founding member last year of the Alliance for Religious Freedom or Belief with the US and some other 40, 50 countries from around the world. And we remain very much committed to promoting and defending freedom of religion and belief around the world.
And this is a related question about the shared values between Brazil and the US. And you mentioned also that both countries are the biggest democracies in the Western Hemisphere. So President Biden, when addressing the Munich Security Conference this February, said that democratic progress is under assault worldwide, both in the US and Europe. How do you see Brazil contributing to President Biden's efforts to convene a summit on global democracies? And what diplomatic role could Brazil play both in Latin America and in the wider global battle of ideas against authoritarianism?
Very good. Look, as I said, this is a shared value. This is first and paramount on our bilateral cooperation agenda at the political level. Brazil and the US have worked together to promote democracy in our hemisphere. Brazil's credentials in that area are pretty obvious. Brazil has a very vibrant democracy with many political parties. Some people joke that we have too many, 34. The Americans have too few too. Perhaps the good ratio is in between. But no question that we have a very, very open political discussion in Brazil, with the total independence of the powers of the branches of government, with an extremely free press, and a very open and candid debate around the country. So that vibrancy is something we bring to the table. And of course, from the foreign policy establishment point of view, that remains a very strong commitment on our part. And we have worked together with the US in both bilaterally and international organizations such as the OAS, and with other groups like the Lima Group and other associations to try to support a peaceful democratic transition in Venezuela, which is where we are witnessing this humanitarian tragedy, which was described by High Commissioner Bachelet as crimes against humanity by the Maduro dictatorship. Of course, we also remain concerned with the longest standing military dictatorship in the Americas, that one in Havana in Cuba. And we very much support whatever the US wants to do in terms of cooperation to help the Cuban people, the great Cuban people, to bring democracy to that part of our hemisphere.
Thank you for your responses. I think now we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. I see a lot of people with their virtual hands raised. If you'd like to speak, please raise your virtual hand. First, I'd like to invite Ambassador Clifford Sobel to speak. I believe you're muted. There we go. Ambassador, I believe we cannot hear you. Maybe if you sign out and sign back in, maybe that will restart your audio, and we'll call on you then. Okay, next up, Juliana Valente, and please introduce yourself briefly when you speak.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Juliana. I'm a student at the CUNY Graduate Center working on my PhD in anthropology. Thank you, Ambassador Forster, for speaking us today, and for Harvard for hosting this event. Ambassador, you mentioned a partnership with the US to fight the pandemic. What exactly is this partnership, and what strategies have been implemented? You spoke about the attempt to increase vaccinations, but will Brazil implement a national lockdown, implement scientifically proven strategies for treating COVID rather than unproven strategies such as the so-called preventive medication, and work with other nations to mitigate the COVID crisis in the country right now? And what exactly is the mitigation plan? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Valente. Thank you for that good question. Look, I hope I don't deceive you. I'm not an expert in public health or epidemiology. What I can bring are facts and data that I have access to, and I would like to share with you to bring perspective in what's going on. So number one, the effort to do whatever is available, is possible to be done, has been there from the get-go, from the Ministry of Health. Brazil was one of the first countries to begin reacting to the alert of the World Health Organization back in January last year, declaring this a public emergency and so on. Early on, there was a division of tasks between the different levels of government in Brazil. You know how vast Brazil is, and the many challenges we have in terms of regional diversity and disparities, and how that poses challenges for us. And that's been one thing that's been in the back of the mind of people who are dealing with the strategy. It was also the federal government's relegated to a role of providing the resources, and basically through the system, our public health system, which has such capillarity. So the idea has been to use what we have, and Brazil has some expertise in terms of massive vaccination campaigns, in the past, and we are using right now 38,000 different public health posts around the country to do the vaccination. We have ongoing effort to expedite the number of people who get vaccinated. The current level is about 300,000 people a day. The Ministry of Health has committed to trying to raise that number as soon as possible to close to 1 million in a very short term. Also, there is a strategy laid out very clearly, singling out for this first phase of vaccination those who are most vulnerable in Brazil. And that we are not innovating in that front. It's public health workers, it's the elderly, but also there's a special commitment to vulnerable communities, especially the indigenous people. And here I think it's something that's not being highlighted enough. The majority, about 75% of indigenous people in the Amazon have already received their first doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, in a large extent thanks to the work done by our armed forces, by both, the Navy with their boats throughout the Amazon, and also the Air Force, bringing these tremendous resources, the vaccines, to those who are most vulnerable in the middle of the jungle. So this is something I think we should be proud of. There are things we continue to do together with the United States. As I said, we would welcome any if there is an excess of vaccines available here, we would very much welcome receiving them, even in the swap basis, in a temporary basis, to expedite our process. And we look forward to working with the new teams here in the United States. I mentioned the scientific part, Ms. Valente. There's a working group at the White House, which is a small group of countries, which brings together experts from, these are all scientists and experts and some top government officials to discuss, therapeutics, vaccination, strategy, logistics, etc., variants, what are the challenges. This has been an ongoing effort. And as I said, we are very glad that, the Biden administration has invited Brazil to continue to be a part of that dialogue. Brazil and the US have, done great things together in the health area. We fought together against the scourge of HIV, against Zika in the past, very successfully, with great scientific cooperation, research cooperation. And Brazil hosts the only Centers for Disease Control attaché in all of the Americas, is based in Brasilia. Right now, we have scientists from the CDC working shoulder to shoulder with Brazilian public health officials all around Brazil to see what more we can do.
Thank you. I see Ambassador Sobel's back. So Ambassador, I invite you to speak again.
I think I'm unmuted.
It works.
You got me. Okay, great. So thanks very much. And I think it's great that Harvard is sponsoring this. And of course, Nick, thanks for inviting me to join. Let me first congratulate the ambassador on putting together this working group with Secretary Kerry on an issue that the entire world is focused on, and hopefully it'll bring the kind of results we're all looking for. When I was the ambassador many, many years ago, I had the good fortune of working with Tom Shannon at that point as well. And one of the priorities we had was our focus on trade and investment opportunities, given the size of our economies and the importance both countries play in the hemisphere. In fact, Ambassador, you mentioned the CEO Forum, which I'm glad to see is prospering. Ambassador Shannon and I really were at the origination of that years ago. So I'm glad to see that you still are very much a supporter of it. Our then Deputy Secretary, a good friend of Ambassador Burns, Bob Zellick, used to talk about made in the Americas. And I think it's something that is a cornerstone of our relationship, which obviously includes a culture that is similar and many other things. With the upcoming Summit of the Americas, which will be hosted in the United States, whether it be late this year or early next year, does Brazil have a priority to stress this opportunity? Is there a big idea that you may be working on for trade and investment in this hemisphere?
Sorry, Ambassador, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sobel, for that question. It's great to have you here with us today. I think it's a very important question, and we have two things that we could do at the Summit of the Americas. The main issue there should be democracy, and I've already mentioned the work we've been doing together to spread democratic values around our hemisphere and foster the peaceful transition in places which currently have non-democratic, tyrannical or dictatorship regimes. But aside from that, perhaps the most effective thing we could do to promote democratic values would be to show how they work to bring economic prosperity. And that's something I've been hearing a lot from the private sector, from both countries, be it the AmCham in São Paulo and Fiesp and the Confederation of Industry, CNI, or here in the US Chambers of Commerce, the Brazil Business Council, other institutions and organizations across the board. Everybody's very much interested in fostering, closer economic and trade relations between Brazil and the United States. If you allow me to share a little secret with you, I've been a career diplomat for 36 years. And one of the things I don't understand, and I think it's a bit of a shame, is why don't the two largest democracies, the two largest economies in the Western Hemisphere, don't have a free trade agreement between them? Call it an economic alliance, as my friends on the Hill prefer to call it. Very good. Why don't we have that? The private sector wants it. It makes sense. We know this might not be something that could be done in the short term. There are TPA issues, immediate political issues to be addressed. We understand that. But I think that should remain high on our agenda if we are to listen to what the private sector says. And the Summit of the Americas, Ambassador Sobel, I think it would provide a unique opportunity to try to bring those two things together, democratic values and the prosperity generated by economic freedom. And nothing better to do that and add a component of trade and investment to whatever we do within the hemisphere.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Professor Sidney Chalhoub to speak.
I thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Thank you for the ambassador to be here. So on February 12th, 2021, Robert Menendez, the chair of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, sent a letter to the Brazilian president, quote, to express my continuing concern about your remarks falsely alleging fraud in the US presidential election of 2020, unquote. The senator proceeds to cite the Brazilian foreign minister, now former foreign minister, to say that the Brazilian administration appeared, quote, to demonstrate a pattern of support for empty conspiracy theories and the domestic terrorists who attacked the US Capitol and American democracy on January 6th. President Bolsonaro's continued support of former President Trump in the months after his electoral defeat was appalling. Trump engaged in a systematic attempt to undermine the US electoral process, impending electoral fraud, talking about impending electoral fraud before the election. He claimed victory before the majority of votes had been counted. He tried to stop counting votes in several states, and so on. He refused to concede his defeat. He engaged in several legal legislative maneuvers to try to prevent Congress from confirming electoral college results. These attempts to discredit the elections led to the riots of January 6th. In sum, Trump attempted a coup d'etat for whatever means. That the Brazilian government supported Trump while he did this is a worrying sign. In fact, Bolsonaro has already started making baseless claims of electoral fraud in preparation for the next year's presidential elections. How can the current Brazilian administration demonstrate to the Biden administration and to the international community at large that it is truly committed to democracy? What assurances can you give that Bolsonaro is not going to follow Trump's example and a Brazilian tradition to attempt a coup d'etat in the country?
Thank you, Professor Chalhoub, for your statement and your question. Look, it's kind of a little bit an outdated question because this has already been answered. There's no doubt about the commitment of President Bolsonaro and the whole Brazilian society to democratic values. As I mentioned here before, we live in a very, very vibrant democratic environment with total independence of powers, with the free expression of ideas from around the political realm. So, we see this, all this as something of the past. And proof of that was the reaction of the White House when it was answering questions about this. They reaffirmed the partnership between Brazil and the US founded on shared values, including the value for democracy. So there's nothing to be reaffirmed other than Brazil continue to be what it is, a very, very vibrant democratic society, and proud of it.
So I think we'll take two at a time now, given the amount of hands we have and the time we have left. So Ambassador Dobriansky and Professor Green.
Thank you. I was going to say, it said you have to unmute me. I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you. First, Nick, thank you and congratulations. It's wonderful that Harvard is hosting this. Our relationship with Brazil matters greatly, and I'm very delighted to see the ambassador. Just it's wonderful that you took the time to come today. I actually was going to ask you about Venezuela. If you'd say a word about what Brazil recommends to the Biden administration as to how to go forward. But I'm going to stick another small one in there because I wasn't planning to. You've mentioned democracy a number of times. The Biden administration is also planning to host a democracy summit. Does Brazil also have ideas on that as to how that democracy summit should be put together? And thank you so much. And good to see you.
Good to see you, Ambassador Dobriansky. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. So, I mentioned Venezuela. Let me just elaborate a little bit more on that. Brazil remains as committed as ever to supporting a peaceful, democratic transition in Venezuela, one that's carried out, led by the Venezuelan people, which are suffering this awful oppression from the Maduro dictatorship for the past years. That commitment has a concrete expression, for instance, in what we've been doing in what we call the Acolhida operation, the Operation Welcome, which has welcomed in Brazil over 250,000 refugees from Venezuela. And when I say welcome, it's really welcoming. We have people at the border documenting these people when they come, giving them a temporary status in Brazil, and giving them more than that, an opportunity for employment, for gainful employment in areas of Brazil where we have more economic activity, because the border with Venezuela there, that's the Amazon. It's not exactly, full of economic opportunity. So we bring these people in Brazil. So there's a whole logistical operation with several partners, UN partners. The US government is
Ambassador, you were muted for a second.
Yeah, I didn't touch anything. Yeah, did you miss my button? Is it okay? So yeah, continue. So I think this is something we should continue to explore, see how we can perhaps improve this whole operation, which has proven to be very successful in helping people on the ground and has earned some international praise from UN countries and institutions. So that's one thing. The thing about the Democracy Summit, I would just insist on what I said before, which is, we should try to connect economic freedom and liberty, freedom, political freedom, and show that, our system, our Western democratic system works best to bring opportunity for everyone. And that's something that I think the Summit of the Americas will provide a moment that we should not let go.
So if we can ask Professor Green and then Stanley Gacek to speak.
Ambassador Forster, my name is James Green. I'm a professor of Brazilian history at Brown University and the former president of the Brazilian Studies Association. And I wanted to follow up a little bit on the question asked by Professor Chalhoub about the past, because you implied that President Bolsonaro's endorsement of Trump's discourse about the elections is something of the past. We all remember the shock that the world who followed the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff had when Jair Bolsonaro, at the time a congressman, not only praised the torturer who was responsible for the torturing of Dilma Rousseff, later implied that she had not been tortured, but also dedicated his impeachment vote to what he called the revolution of 1964, which we know was the language of the military dictatorship justifying the illegal taking of power in 1964. If the current government claims to be defenders of democracy, has President Bolsonaro changed his position and now considers the dictatorship that ruled from 1964 to 1985 as in fact, a democratic regime? And how can we believe the current government with its discourse on democracy when it defends as torturing and a military government that was in power for 21 years?
Thanks, Professor. I invite Stanley to speak.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Erika. Ambassador Forster, thanks very much for being here. Ambassador Shannon, very good to see you again, albeit virtually. In the interest of transparency, I'll also identify myself fully. I'm the Senior Advisor for Global Strategies at the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, representing 1.3 million working women and men in the United States and Canada in the supermarket, meatpacking, and healthcare industries. Our workers, our members are on the front line of the pandemic. And prior to that, I served for 5 years at the ILO mission in Brazil as Deputy Director and Officer in Charge. I'm glad to participate in this event at Harvard, being an alum of the college and the law school. Ambassador Forster, my question is this. President Joe Biden declared during his campaign that he would be the most pro-union and pro-worker president in the history of the United States. And he reinforced that claim recently by saying in a recorded video message that he supported more unionism, more labor rights, more collective bargaining rights, and that the clear right to form a union had to be the workers' decision and not the employers'. It's really unprecedented in United States history. He was making a clear reference to the current effort to organize a union, that's our union's effort, at the massive Amazon unit employing 6,000 workers in Bessemer, Alabama. President Jair Bolsonaro, on the other hand, stated 2 months after his election that there could either be more labor rights or more employment in Brazil, but not both. He also justified his termination of the labor ministry, a respected, critical, and strategic Brazilian institution, which has existed for decades, by suggesting that it had become union-dominated. He also advocated the termination of Brazil's specialized system of labor justice courts, which have contributed to stable labor relations and led to legal stability, which employers rely on. Moreover, he has called for the legal primacy of individual over collective agreements, which would destroy the total integrity of Brazilian collective bargaining, already undermined drastically by the labor law reform of 2017. He also issued a medida provisoria terminating union dues checkoff, even for voluntary union members, contributing further to the financial hemorrhaging of the Brazilian labor unions caused by the 2017 reform. That medida provisoria is terminated, but it did its damage. So, Mr. Ambassador, how can your government work with the Biden administration on the mutual strengthening of labor and trade union rights when it seems clear that President Bolsonaro has a contrary agenda?
Thank you very much, Stan. Good to see you again.
Good to see you
Thank
again.
you for that question. Let me start with Professor Green. Professor Green, thank you very much for your question, sir. Look, we are not living in the past here. We have a proven record of democratic values which are working in our country. And I'd say, just to sum it up, not to be too long-winded in my reply, President Bolsonaro himself has spent most of his adult life in the Brazilian Congress, winning re-election, mandate after mandate. He was 27 years, if I'm not mistaken, a congressman in the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. being supported, being voted in by the great people of Rio de Janeiro, I'd say that that's democratic credential enough. He doesn't need to prove anything beyond that. But as a president, he has done nothing to curtail the tremendous support for democracy that is enshrined in our very constitution. Yeah, and I'd say in our very fiber as a society and as a country. Brazilians are very tolerant people, very open. Brazilian likes novelty. As you being an expert in Brazil, I think know firsthand from your experience there. So the vibrancy of our democracy is there. I don't see any serious will to return to a non-democratic past which lies distant in our history right now. Thank you for your question anyway. Now, Mr. Gacek, you said that, and I think you're right, President Biden is committed, and he has said as much in improving and increasing more labor rights, bringing more labor rights to the United States, to the American workers. And I say that Brazil is in a very privileged position to cooperate with that. Because as you know, firsthand, you worked for the ILO, Brazil is a signatory to more ILO conventions than the United States. Brazil has a more extensive and generous labor laws than the United States and many other developed countries. That's a fact. Of course, there might be challenges here and there for enforcement and so on. I concede that, but let's work on improving enforcement. You mentioned the labor justice courts that we have. They are still standing. Nobody has touched on them, and they're still going strong. About 95% of their decisions are pro-employee, pro-worker. That's working. Now, the fact that we had a change in the Brazilian legislation, and I think this was something that was in the previous administration, if I'm not correct, if I'm not wrong, and not mistaken. We try to update and modernize part of our labor laws to try to improve competitiveness for our businesses. That was something that was called for by many worker organizations, by the private sector. It was not something that was imposed unilaterally. And it's proven to be right, reducing the costs of doing business, which at the end of the day is what generates employment and opportunities for Brazilians, which is what we are interested in. As for one final point, on the question of the Ministry of Labor having been abolished, it was actually transformed into one secretariat within the Ministry of the Economy. Look, the Ministry of Industry and Commerce was also transformed into a secretariat. And one would not argue that Brazil is giving up on its industry and commerce. So I don't think it works. I think it's just a bureaucratic administrative rearrangement, and the commitment to supporting labor rights in Brazil is as strong as ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we'll take 3 at a time in this round. So Bruno, and then Natalia, and then Carlos.
Thank you so much, Erika. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. My name is Bruno. I'm a Master in Public Administration student at Harvard and an MBA student at Stanford, current president of the Brazil Caucus at Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Brazilian Association. I'm super glad to have you as our ambassador, someone very talented, experienced. But before that was a reality, I was very concerned about having Eduardo Bolsonaro as a possible ambassador. I would love to hear about the risks of having someone like him as the ambassador, and how was the process in your perspective?
Natalia?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm in a little bit of a noisy place. I hope you can hear me, and apology for the noise around. Ambassador, I wanted to, I heard some very concerning statements that seem to be untrue so far regarding indigenous. So, because President Bolsonaro has expressed a fervently antagonistic position towards indigenous people since before he was elected, when he made a campaign promise not to demarcate any territorial and indigenous land, national territory as indigenous land. despite the fact that he was doing so is an unmet promise of the 1988 Constitution. For the past 27 months, he and his members of his administration have worked tirelessly to erode the well-being of indigenous people, encouraging the violent deforestation of indigenous territories, turning a blind eye to illegal mining on traditional indigenous land, undermining indigenous education, and failing to safeguard vulnerable communities during a pandemic that continued to ravage the country. Worst of all, Bolsonaro has heightened anti-indigenous sentiment by fanning old flames of racism, dehumanizing native Brazilians in public discourse, and promoting a false choice between indigenous rights and the interests of other economic vulnerable peoples. And so how do you square the government's duty to uphold the Constitution with its failure to protect the constitutional rights of indigenous peoples? And how do you square the government's duty to uphold national law with its failure to hold the transgressors of indigenous rights accountable for their actions? Thank you. I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry. My name is Natalia de Campos. I am a performance artist and an activist from the Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee in New York.
Thank you, Carlos.
Ambassador, I'll keep my remarks brief. I just wanted to thank everyone for this amazing event. My full question is in the chat. I was hoping if you could offer a few comments on the Brazilian agenda during spring meetings. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. The Brazilian agenda on?
Our spring meetings. Our spring meetings.
The spring meetings. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
A lot of questions.
The ball is on my court. Yeah, let's begin from the beginning. Mr. Bueno, thank you for your question and for your good words. For me, look, I'm not in a position to comment on who the president considers to come to a certain position or not. He was elected by 50 million Brazilians who freely and fairly elected him as president. He can choose whoever he seems fit to the job. It's not up to me to be commenting on that. So, with that, I'll move on to Ms. Campos. I don't think your lengthy statement is right on several counts. I'll try to address some of them on a fact-based reply. So, it doesn't work to quote people out of context and then try to transform that into policy. And that's one thing that I try to frame our work here in all fronts, is I'm always open and ready to discuss any policy issue, foreign policy, questions of, health policy, we can discuss policy. But when we bring politics into it too much, we ended up generating more heat than light, and we don't see exactly what's going on. So let me try to address the question of indigenous peoples during the Bolsonaro administration. I think there's a continued commitment to respecting whatever we have in terms of a great infrastructure of Indian reservations around Brazil. You who are familiar with that know that those reservations, many of them are larger, or them put together are larger than several European countries. So it's not that Brazil has a problem with not having enough land for the indigenous peoples. We have a tremendous amount, and of course there are challenges there in protecting these people from illegal activities, and that's what the president did with the Operation Green Brazil 1 and 2. So to say that the president didn't do anything, it runs counter to the basic facts. The facts are there. I reported for you here the amount of people that were arrested, the equipment that was apprehended, the fines that were applied, over $620 million in fines. So that's one side. But let's look on the positive side. The Bolsonaro administration has people of indigenous background in the administration. President Bolsonaro was the first Brazilian president to include an indigenous woman in our official delegation to the United Nations General Assembly. I was there. I met her just in 2019 when we still had in-person meetings. And she was representing, like, I don't know how many, 30, 40 tribes from the Amazon. So to try to perhaps get grievances from one group and try to blame that and say that you speak on behalf of all the Brazilian, the hundreds of indigenous peoples we still have in Brazil, thanks be to God, it's not fair for the record. Now, aside from that, I just mentioned here the very, very important concern with the health and well-being of these people, including with the cash transfers that were done by the federal government, 1, 2, with the vaccine campaign, the ongoing one. Over 70% of indigenous peoples have already been vaccinated in Brazil because they have been included in the most vulnerable bracket of our population. So we cannot argue that there's neglect there, much to the contrary. There's a high consideration to their specific situation. But I would go beyond that and say that what's different about President Bolsonaro's administration in this regard, and perhaps that's why he's getting some criticism, is that he has been actually listening to indigenous peoples who say, look, we are here in this tremendous area. We know that we have great resources here. We are sitting on top of very important minerals. For instance, we need economic opportunity, and previous administrations said, go harvest some fruits and don't annoy me. No, we need to address seriously, bring opportunity for these people in the Amazon, and we'll not do that with the subsistence economy. That's what's different. And we've heard, and I've read about this from themselves, indigenous peoples who say, look, there are ways to do sustainable mining. There's technology that would enable us to get the rich minerals which are in the subsoil of our land, of our ancestral land, and put that to good use, creating opportunity for us, because that's what we need. So that's, just broadening the discussion, that's on the table as well. Okay, so I don't think there's any shortage of commitment there and of real achievement towards the indigenous peoples in Brazil, of which we are so proud of as Brazilians. Let me tell you that. Now, spring meetings, switching the agenda here to, I understand you're referring to the World Bank and IMF meetings here in Washington. I mean, there's something that's covered more directly by our Ministry of the Economy. We play a secondary role in following what's going on. There are, of course, discussions which have a great bearing for our foreign policy. We have been following, for instance, the whole discussion on transparency going on at the World Bank right now. We also welcome whatever initiatives might help us do what I said we intend to do here in terms of strengthening our fight against deforestation and illegal activities in the Amazon. And there are many institutional capacity there that can help us do just that. At the IMF, there's the whole discussion of the recovery from the pandemic and how are we going to be faring in the upcoming months. I just participated in a briefing, in a private briefing for ambassadors and executive directors on the economic outlook, and I'll not delve too much into that. But I like some of the things that were shared there about the resilience of some economies, including Brazil, to make an important comeback as vaccination advances and the awful numbers we've been seeing start to go down. So we are following that agenda very closely.
Thank you, Ambassador. We do not have any more time for questions. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Professor Burns would like to say a few words.
Erika, thank you. And I really want to give a chance to Ambassador Shannon to make some comments, having heard the discussion. But first, I want to thank Ambassador Forster for being with us. It's in our tradition at Harvard to want to listen to representatives of friendly governments, and there's a great interest at our university. You've heard from faculty and students in Brazil. I also want to thank those who ask questions. I want to particularly thank Professor Chalhoub and Professor Green. They articulated, I've been watching the chat as well as I would as a professor. They've articulated, I think, a real concern, Ambassador, that Brazil's environmental practices may be going in the opposite direction, where at least the current American administration of President Biden is going. I saw a comment by Tim Linden on reports that some critics of the government have been intimidated from speaking out by the police. Comments on indigenous peoples by at least two comments 3 comments on indigenous peoples in the chat. I think the chat's an important way to learn. And finally, my own view, and I'll turn this over to Ambassador Shannon, is that I do think that this is going to be a rocky period for U.S.-Brazil relations. The challenge of diplomacy, as all of us know, is to try to reconcile sometimes opposing viewpoints. The fact that President Bolsonaro was such a fervent supporter of President Trump, which is not customary in global politics for one leader to come out in support of another personally during an election campaign, it's just going to have to be overcome by the Brazilian government. So you are most welcome here. We enjoyed listening to your presentation. I did want to note, in the spirit of academic freedom and honesty, I think this is going to be a tough relationship. Not that we can't resolve the problems, but there are certainly some significant differences between these two governments. But Tom and Erika, you're the two that co-moderated this. Maybe we should end with comments from both of you.
Well, first, just let me echo what Nick said in regard to thanking you, Ambassador Foster, for being with us today. It was, and this is an important discussion, but also thank all of those who joined and asked questions. This underscores, I believe, first, the tremendous interest in the U.S.-Brazil relationship, but the vigor and the tone of the conversation also highlights just how important these issues are and how deeply felt they are. And while this might lead to rough edges occasionally, what it does show is that people care about the relationship. They care about the United States, and they care about Brazil, and they care about how these two great democracies and these two great economies cooperate. And Nick says that, you know, we could be facing some tough times, but having great diplomats act as mediators between sometimes challenging political realities is important. And in this regard, let me express my respect for you, Ambassador Foster, for what you're doing and for what your colleagues are doing. It's an important relationship, and how we deepen it over time is going to determine really not just the welfare and well-being of our two great peoples, but also our Western Hemisphere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.